Story 1. The break room at my lab wasn't exactly cozy. It had the usual: a fridge humming in the corner, mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that spat out something vaguely resembling coffee. But there was something unique about ours: a memorial space. Pictures of staff who'd passed on, along with flowers, little trinkets, and sometimes handwritten notes, filled a small shelf. It was meant to honor them, but it always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the silence that hung in the air around it, like the dead were watching. I work late shifts, and that night was no different. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I wrapped up my work, the building practically deserted except for me and the faint echo of a cleaning crew somewhere down the hall. I was starving and decided to grab a snack from my locker in the break room. I didn't like going in there alone at night. Something about the room felt wrong, but hunger won. I pushed open the door, and the first thing I noticed was the chill. It wasn't freezing, but it was colder than it had any right to be. My breath caught as I stepped in. The hum of the fridge, the click of the clock on the wall, it all felt louder than usual. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the locker across the room. But out of the corner of my vision, I noticed something strange. The air by the memorial shelf seemed heavy, like the light bent around it differently. I shook my head. I was tired, I told myself. Just grab the snack and leave. And then it happened. One of their pictures, flew off the shelf. I'm not talking about it sliding off or falling gently. This thing flew. I froze, my hand halfway to my locker. It didn't make any sense. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have caused it. But that wasn't the worst part. The picture didn't just hit the ground. It soared across the room, almost gracefully, and landed right in front of me, face up, and it was staring at me. The woman in the photo, Mary, had been a long-time lab tech before I'd even joined the team. Everyone said she was the heart of the lab. She passed away last year, sudden aneurysm while on vacation. I'd never met her, but I'd heard plenty about her. People still talked about how much they missed her, and now her face was looking up at me, almost like she was expecting me to say something. But that wasn't all. The picture hadn't landed alone. It had somehow managed to snag someone's jacket from a nearby chair on its way down. The jacket had cushioned the fall perfectly, like the photo was being protected. I stared, my brain racing to make sense of it. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. Nope, I muttered, stepping back. But my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. Something compelled me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was respect. But I bent down, trembling, and picked up the photo. Her eyes seemed brighter than they had any right to be in a dimly lit room. Almost alive. I swallowed hard. I don't know why I did it, but I said, "Hi, nice to meet you." My voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper, and as soon as the words left my mouth, the air in the room shifted. The heaviness lifted. It was subtle, but I felt it, like something or someone was satisfied. I didn't linger. I carefully placed the photo back on the shelf, making sure it was secure. "There you go," I said, my voice shaking. "All good now." I backed away, not taking my eyes off the shelf. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on it. Not until I was at the door. And then I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was in my car. The door locked, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat there staring at the entrance to the building, half expecting something or someone to come after me. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, guess what? Mary's picture flew off the wall and introduced itself to me. Yeah, that'd go over great. People would think I'd lost it. Maybe I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real, that she was real. The next day, I avoided the break room like the plague, but curiosity got the better of me by the afternoon. I needed to see if the picture was still there, if it was back on the shelf where I'd left it. My stomach churned as I pushed the door open. There it was, right in its spot, perfectly aligned with the others. No sign of anything unusual. But as I stared at it, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small handwritten note tucked behind the frame. It wasn't there the night before. I was sure of it. My hands shook as I reached for it, pulling it free. It was simple. Just 4 words written in neat cursive. Thank you for listening. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. All I know is that I'm not stepping into that break room alone ever again. Story 2. It was my 5th year working in the hospital lab. Night shifts weren't new to me. The hum of machines and the occasional distant beeps of monitors upstairs were my constant companions. I didn't mind the solitude. There was something calming about the predictable rhythm of the analyzers and the quiet tension of being one of the few people awake and working while the world outside slept. That night started like any other. I had clocked in at 11 p.m., exchanged half-hearted pleasantries with the evening tech as they left, and settled into my routine. The machines were behaving, the samples were coming through steadily, and the coffee was still hot. By 2 a.m., I had processed over 100 specimens. I remember thinking it was one of those nights where everything just worked, until it didn't. It began with the analyzer's chime, a subtle but insistent sound that signaled an error. It wasn't uncommon. Machines act up. Tubes get stuck. Labels don't scan. I sighed, put down my coffee, and walked over to the line. The error was at the barcode reader station. A tube had jammed. At first glance, it looked simple enough to fix. The release arm had closed too early, trapping the tube halfway through the reader. I tried to dislodge it, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned in closer. The way it was wedged didn't make sense. It wasn't just stuck, it was jammed in with a force that shouldn't have been possible. I grabbed the manual release tool and gave it a nudge. Nothing. Annoyed, I applied more force, practically yanking at the release mechanism. When it finally gave, the tube shot loose and nearly fell to the floor. I caught it just in time and flipped it over to check the label. That's when my stomach dropped. The name on the tube was hers. For 44 years, she had worked in this lab. She was a legend, part of the old clinical lab technician program, back when the hospital was independent and things were done by hand. She had been the chem supervisor for as long as I could remember. Everyone respected her. Hell, we all feared her a little too. She had retired the year before after her lung cancer diagnosis. It was aggressive and the prognosis had been grim, but she never let it slow her down, even in her final days. She kept in touch, sent emails, asked about the lab. I knew she was upstairs in the ICU. We all did. She was nearing the end. I stared at the tube in my hand. It wasn't a current specimen. I remembered it immediately. One of her old blood samples, drawn months ago for a research study. It had been processed, stored, and forgotten in the stockyard, along with thousands of others. The system shouldn't have pulled it. There were no pending tests, no orders in the queue. It had been filed away, its purpose fulfilled. There was no reason for it to be on the line. Yet here it was, in my hand. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and placed the tube in the discard rack. These things happen sometimes. Machines glitch. Maybe someone had accidentally triggered a recall, but deep down, I knew better. At 2:45 a.m., I finished clearing the error and went back to my station. The hum of the machines filled the room again, steady and predictable. I tried to focus, but my mind kept circling back to the jammed tube. 15 minutes later, my shift ended. The day shift was starting to trickle in, and I handed off the workload, careful not to mention what had happened. It was too strange, too coincidental. I didn't want to sound paranoid. As I walked out of the lab, one of the ICU nurses passed me in the hallway. She looked drained. "Rough night?" I asked. She nodded. "We lost someone." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, then said her name. 2 a.m., the nurse added softly. She passed at exactly 2 a.m. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts raced back to the jammed tube, the name on the label, the time the error had occurred. 2 a.m. I spent the rest of the day replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The system had pulled her old blood, stored away for months, and sent it through the line without an order, exactly as she took her final breath. I checked the system logs the next night, desperate for an explanation. There was no record of the tube being recalled. The analyzer logs showed the error, but nothing about why the sample had been retrieved. It was as if the machine had acted on its own. I told no one. What was there to say? To this day, I can't explain it. Machines don't just do things without reason. Blood doesn't jam itself into impossible positions, and samples from the dead don't reappear on the line moments after they've passed. But it happened. I was there. Story 3. I was stationed at the blood bank one cold, dead silent night. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on the world. I had been interning at the hospital for about 3 months, shadowing the night shift staff. The blood bank wasn't my usual post. I typically stuck to the lab. But that night, I had been asked to fill in because someone called out sick. The blood bank was in the hospital's basement, tucked into a corner with dim fluorescent lights and the faint hum of refrigeration units. It wasn't creepy during the day, but at night, with the distant echoes of the hospital's machinery and the occasional muffled sound of footsteps upstairs, it was unnerving. There were only 2 of us that night. Me and Ethan, a fellow intern I barely knew. He was tall and wiry, with a nervous energy that made the already tense atmosphere even more unsettling. It was around 2:30 in the morning when it happened. Ethan and I had settled into a strained silence. He was scrolling on his phone, and I was flipping through a clipboard of inventory sheets, pretending to focus. The blood bank's refrigeration unit, the BB ref, as we called it, sat across the room. It was a massive glass-fronted unit with rows of labeled bags neatly organized inside. The glass was slightly fogged from the cold, a faint sheen of condensation giving it a ghostly look. "Did you hear that?" Ethan suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I froze, my pen hovering over the clipboard. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice low. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Like, I don't know, a tap or something." I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the hum of the fridge. "Probably just the compressor kicking on," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Ethan nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He put his phone down and stared at the fridge, his leg bouncing nervously. A few minutes passed in silence, and I started to relax. I had just convinced myself that Ethan was jumpy for no reason when I saw it. A handprint. A single, clear handprint appeared on the inside of the BB referee's glass door, right at eye level. It wasn't there before. I was certain of that. The fingers were long and thin, the print slightly smudged as if the hand had pressed firmly against the cold surface. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He was already staring at the glass, his face pale. "You see that?" he finally whispered back. I nodded. Neither of us moved. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Condensation? A trick of the light? Someone else in the room earlier? But none of it made sense. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. There was no way anyone could have touched it without opening the fridge, and the door hadn't moved. "Maybe it's, just..." Ethan trailed off, his voice trembling. And then another one appeared, right next to the first. This time the fingers dragged down slightly, leaving streaks in the condensation. My stomach clenched. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "Is someone in there?" Ethan whispered. His voice cracked, and I could hear the panic rising. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. "It's locked, and it's freezing in there." But even as I said it, a third handprint appeared, higher up, as if whoever, or whatever, was inside was reaching for the top of the glass. This one was smaller, almost childlike. My breath hitched in my throat. "We need to call someone," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "Who?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "What are we going to say? Hey, there are ghost handprints on the blood fridge?" Before Ethan could respond, the overhead lights flickered. Not the usual dimming you get with old fluorescents. These lights went completely out for a full second before snapping back on. When they did, all the handprints were gone. Ethan let out a shaky breath, but I couldn't look away from the fridge. The glass was clean now, as if nothing had happened. "You saw that, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I saw it." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the fridge. I kept expecting the handprints to come back, but they didn't. The hum of the refrigeration unit was the only sound, but it felt louder now, more oppressive. I think we should check it, Ethan finally said, though he sounded far from convinced. Are you insane? I hissed. But he was already standing, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys clipped to his badge. We have to, he said, his voice shaking. What if there's, I don't know, a leak or something? A leak, I repeated, incredulous. What kind of leak leaves handprints? He ignored me and stepped toward the fridge. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as he unlocked the door and pulled it open. A blast of icy air hit me from across the room, making me shiver. Ethan peered inside, his breath visible in the cold. There's nothing, he said after a moment, his voice hollow. He reached in and moved a few of the blood bags aside, as if expecting to find someone hiding in the back. It's empty. Relief and dread washed over me simultaneously. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way the handprints had appeared and disappeared so suddenly made my skin crawl. Close it, I said, my voice shaking. Just close it. Ethan hesitated, then slowly pushed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, and the hum of the refrigeration unit resumed its steady rhythm. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. And then we heard it, a single faint tap on the glass. Neither of us moved. The sound came again, louder this time. A tap followed by a slow, deliberate drag, like fingernails scraping against the inside of the glass. We bolted. Neither of us said a word as we ran up the stairs and into the brightly lit main hallway of the hospital. We didn't stop until we were in the staff lounge, our backs against the wall, gasping for air. I never went back to the blood bank after that night. I couldn't. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. Ethan and I never spoke about it again. It was as if acknowledging it would make it real, and neither of us wanted that. Story 4. Our histopathology lab was a good walk away from the main hospital building, tucked into the farthest corner of the compound. If you think hospitals can feel eerie at night, try working in a separate structure surrounded by silence, away from the safety of bustling wards and bright corridors. The only way to get to it was through an older building, a relic from the early 1900s that had stood untouched for decades, carrying with it whispers of its own unsettling past. I could fill pages with the stories I've heard about that building, but I'll save those for another time. It was during one of my overnight shifts as an intern that this happened. There were 3 licensed techs overseeing the night shift that evening, along with about 10 of us interns. It wasn't uncommon for us to grow restless during these quiet hours, with not much to do except wait for the occasional specimen. The silence of the lab was oppressive at night, broken only by the whir of machines and our muffled conversations. That particular night, one of the senior techs, Miss Rivera, told us she needed to check on something back at the main lab in the hospital. She gave us a quick glance as she grabbed her coat. "Keep all the lights on," she said firmly, "and leave the radio playing. You'll thank me later." The way she said it sent a small shiver down my spine, but we shrugged it off. I exchanged a glance with my partner for the shift, Clara. She rolled her eyes and chuckled. "She acts like we're kids or something. It's just a lab." Once Miss Rivera left, the quiet swallowed us whole. For a while, we did as she'd instructed. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the countertops and machines, and the radio hummed softly, playing old hits no one cared about. But after a couple of hours, fatigue started creeping in. The hum of the machines became hypnotic, lulling us into a daze. "This is ridiculous," Clara groaned, rubbing her eyes. "We don't need every light in this place on, and this radio is just annoying." I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the door where Miss Rivera had disappeared earlier. Something about her tone had stuck with me, but I couldn't quite place why. Still, I wasn't about to argue. "Fine," I said, "but let's keep the desk lamp on at least, just in case." Clara smirked, satisfied. She clicked off the main lights, leaving the lab bathed in dim, uneven shadows. She flicked off the radio, and just like that, the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. We sat at the desk, our chairs squeaking faintly as we shifted, trying to stay awake. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, just the creak of the old floors settling. But then they came again, Sharp, deliberate clicks, like someone walking on tile in heels. Clara froze, her eyes locking on mine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. The steps were steady, unhurried, and they seemed to move around the lab. First near the counters, then closer to the machines, then behind us. Clara began, her voice trembling, but I shook my head sharply. "Don't," I whispered. I didn't know what else to say. We both sat there, rigid, our ears straining to track the sound. The clicks circled us, deliberate, almost taunting. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst. "It's probably Miss Rivera," Clara whispered, though her voice lacked any conviction. "Miss Rivera wears sneakers," I replied, barely able to get the words out. Then the footsteps stopped. We didn't dare turn around. My breath was shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly they ached. The silence stretched on, unbearable, and I began to wonder if maybe somehow we had imagined it after all. And then, the chair at the far end of the room scraped loudly across the floor. Clara let out a small, choked gasp, and I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The lights flickered on abruptly, flooding the room with harsh brightness. Miss Rivera stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and something else. Something like fear. "What the hell are you two doing?" she snapped, her voice breaking the spell. Neither of us could answer. Clara was pale, her hands shaking. I swallowed hard, trying to find words that made sense. "There were footsteps," I finally managed. Miss Rivera's eyes narrowed. "I told you to keep the lights on and the radio playing." She stepped fully into the room, glancing around as if searching for something. "This place, it doesn't like being ignored." "What do you mean?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Ms. Rivera didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the radio, turning it back on. The soft hum of music filled the room, chasing away the oppressive silence. "Just do as you're told," she said finally, her tone sharp. "And don't stay here alone again." She didn't explain further, and we didn't dare press her. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though neither of us could shake the tension that clung to the air. The next morning, as we were leaving, Clara turned to me, her face still pale. "You don't think—" "I don't want to think about it," I interrupted. But I did. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the deliberate, unhurried pace, the way they had circled us. And the chair, that sound still haunts me. I've heard the stories about the old hospital building, about the things that linger in places steeped in history and grief. But I never thought I'd experience it myself. I never worked another night shift in that lab again. Story 5, I worked in a small biotech lab tucked away in an industrial park. It wasn't the kind of place you'd notice unless you were looking for it. A brick building with narrow windows and an air of secrecy about it. Inside, we were surrounded by sterile white walls, humming equipment, and the faint, ever-present smell of ethanol. I'd been there for 3 years, long enough to know every creak of the floor and every flicker of the fluorescent lights. One Tuesday evening, I was working late with Sarah, one of the other lab techs. The two of us had been stuck running PCR tests all day, trying to troubleshoot an experiment that refused to cooperate. The lab was dead quiet, save for the soft whir of the centrifuge and the occasional beep from the thermal cycler. Most of the team had already left for the night, leaving the building eerily still. We hung our micropipettes on these magnetic hooks Rainin made, sleek little things that attached to the edge of the metal shelves at eye level. They kept the pipettes within easy reach, though I always felt uneasy about how precarious they looked hanging there. Sarah had just finished loading another set of samples, and I was adjusting the settings on the spectrophotometer when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, a shift. It was so quick, I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all, but then I heard the faintest clink, like metal slipping against metal. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp in the silence. I turned my head just in time to see one of the pipetters, a P20, wobbling on its hook. The thing was barely hanging on, tilting further and further until, clatter, it fell, or at least it should have. What happened next is something I've replayed in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it. The pipetter didn't hit the floor. Instead, it dropped straight down and landed, perfectly upright, in a tip. Not just any tip, mind you. An open box of 20 microlighter tips sitting on the edge of the bench. The pipetter plunged into one of them, standing there like some bizarre exclamation mark. For a second, neither of us said a word. We just stared at it, frozen, our eyes wide. "No way," Sarah whispered finally, breaking the silence. I walked over, my steps slow and deliberate, like I was afraid the thing might do something else. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud it drowned out the hum of the equipment. I reached out and grabbed the pipetter, pulling it free. The tip stayed attached. I held it up, turning it over in my hands as if that might reveal some trick or hidden mechanism. It didn't. It was just a pipette, the same one I'd used hundreds of times. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's not heavy enough to fall like that. And how could it land in a tip?" I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was how fast it had moved, how precise the landing had been. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. We both stood there for a long time, staring at the pipetteur, the box of tips, the hook on the shelf where it had hung moments before. I don't know what I was expecting, some kind of explanation to materialize out of thin air maybe, but none came. Finally, Sarah laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "Maybe it's a sign," she said. "A sign of what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She shrugged, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I don't know. Bad luck? Ghosts? You tell me." I didn't laugh. The rest of the night was tense, and neither of us brought up the pipetter again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past the shelf, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the air around it had changed, grown heavier somehow. The next morning, I came in early to set up for the day's experiments. Sarah wasn't in yet, and the lab was quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I went to grab a pipetter and froze. The hook where the 20 pesos had hung was empty. I frowned, glancing around the bench. It wasn't there. The box of tips was gone too. "Looking for something?" Sarah's voice startled me, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, a coffee cup in hand. "Yeah," I said. "Did you move the 20 pesos? She frowned, setting her cup down. "Number why?" "It's not here," I said, my voice faltering. She walked over, her brow furrowed. Together we searched the bench, the drawers, and the shelves. But the pipette and the box of tips were gone. We never found them. Story 6. It was during my internship at the hospital, a grueling night shift, and I was assigned to the microbiology section. The hospital's laboratory was a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors, sterile counters, and the cold hum of machines. The staff were used to working late into the night, and for the most part, we were left to our own devices. That particular night, it was my turn to handle the specimen logging. The lab was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant murmur of voices from the receiving area. My colleagues, both the staff and my fellow interns, had drifted off to their usual corners. Some were chatting at the receiving area, others loitered near the lab's main doors. I was alone in my section, a corner tucked farthest from anyone else. It must have been close to 11 p.m. when it happened. I remember it clearly because I had just checked the time while flipping through a microbiology textbook. Exams were coming up, and every spare second counted. With the specimens logged, I decided to use the downtime to cram. The first sign that something was wrong came subtly. I felt it rather than heard it, a shift in the air, as though someone had moved close enough to brush against me. A faint chill ran along my arms, though I ignored it. Old buildings like this one had drafts, and I chalked it up to that. But then I heard it, a whisper. Low, soft, and unmistakable, it came from just behind me. The sound was so close it could have come from below my shoulder. Low enough to match the height of a child. "Hey!" My breath hitched. The whisper wasn't loud, but it was there, clear as day. I froze, my pen hovering over the page I had been jotting notes on. For a split second, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, the lab was deserted on my end, and no one else was near me. Then it came again. "Hey!" The voice was playful, almost teasing, and yet there was a strange, hollow quality to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't move. It felt as though something was holding me in place, paralyzing me with a mix of fear and dread. Finally, I snapped out of it. Heart racing, I spun around in my chair, my eyes darting wildly around the room. Nothing, just rows of sterile counters, stacks of specimen containers, and the faint hum of the equipment. I bolted. Adrenaline coursed through me as I dashed out of the section, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I burst into the receiving area, where I found the staff and interns huddled together, laughing about something. My arrival was sudden enough to startle them. "What's wrong with you?" one of my co-interns asked, her smile fading as she took in my wide eyes and trembling hands. "You guys are jerks," I blurted, still catching my breath. "Why would you sneak up on me like that? Who whispered behind me?" Their confusion was immediate and unfeigned. "What are you talking about?" another intern asked, frowning. "You were in my section, weren't you?" "Someone whispered behind me, twice." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. One of the senior technicians stepped forward, her face serious. "We've been here the whole time," she said, gesturing to the group. "No one's left this area for the past 20 minutes. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest. I turned to my co-interns. "What about you guys? Were you near the lab door?" They shook their heads. "No," one of them said firmly. "We've been standing here. Why?" My stomach dropped. The distance between their location and my section was far too great for anyone to have whispered to me and returned unnoticed. It didn't make sense. My heart pounded as my thoughts spiraled, trying to find a logical explanation. And then I remembered. At the start of our internship, one of the staff had shared a story. It had seemed harmless at the time, a silly ghost tale meant to scare the newbies. She had spoken about a child who was said to haunt the microbiology section, a mischievous presence that made itself known late at night. According to her, there had been incidents over the years, unexplained laughter, faint whispers, and, most unsettlingly, the heavy glass door that separated the lab from the corridor opening and closing on its own. I laughed it off when she told us. It had seemed like just another urban legend, the kind of thing you hear in old hospitals. But now, standing there in the brightly lit receiving area, surrounded by confused faces, the memory hit me like a freight train. The whisper, the child's height, the playful, teasing tone. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "What is it?" the senior technician asked, her tone cautious. I shook my head, unwilling to say it out loud. If I acknowledged it, if I gave it weight, it would make the experience all too real. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I avoided my section for as long as I could, sticking close to the others whenever possible. But even with the company, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision sent my heart racing. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, and I didn't dare bring it up again with my co-interns. Some things are better left unspoken, but I'll never forget the whisper, the way it sounded so close, so human, and yet so utterly wrong. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced that night, and I don't think I want to. Story 7. I work in a hospital laboratory, specifically the blood bank. It's a tightly secured area. No one gets in without proper clearance, and even then, people are usually too busy to wander in unannounced. It's one of those places where every sound matters. The faint hum of the centrifuge, the beep of a machine signaling completion, or the muffled footsteps of a colleague. These become your soundtrack during long, solitary shifts. It was a Friday night, close to midnight, and the hospital was quieter than usual. I had volunteered for the late shift because I preferred the calm. I was stationed at my bench, focused on cross-matching blood for a patient in the ICU. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the sterile smell of alcohol swabs hung in the air. I wasn't thinking about much, just running through my tasks as efficiently as possible. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a swinging lab coat brushing through the doorway to my left. The blood bank has 2 doors. The one on the far side is an exit, heavy with a hydraulic arm that creaks loudly every time it's open. The other is the main entrance, always propped open because we're already inside a secure lab. No one sneaks in or out of this place without being noticed. So when I saw the coat swinging, I naturally assumed someone had walked in to drop off a sample. "Hey," I said without looking up, expecting to hear a colleague's voice or see a gloved hand reaching out with a labeled vial. But there was no reply. I glanced toward the door. No one. The bench where samples are usually dropped off was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe whoever it was had doubled back. Maybe they forgot something. But I hadn't heard the creak of the exit door. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. Silence. I set the test tube down carefully, my hands suddenly shaky. I turned in my chair to get a full view of the room. The blood bank isn't large. The entire area is visible with a quick sweep of the eyes. Rows of labeled refrigerators hummed against the walls, their tiny green lights glowing steadily. The workstation computers were all idle. No one was there. I got up, my lab coat swishing around my knees as I moved toward the entrance. The corridor outside was deserted, its bright lights making the emptiness feel even starker. There were no footsteps fading into the distance, no voices echoing down the hall. Just stillness. I went back inside, shaking my head. Maybe I'd imagined it. Lack of sleep, long hours. It wouldn't be the first time my mind had played tricks on me. Still, I felt uneasy. I returned to my station, my back now fully aware of how exposed it was to the open room. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but every creak of the building, every faint sound seemed amplified. My eyes darted to the doorway every few seconds. Then it happened again. This time, I didn't just see it, I felt it. A gust of cold air brushed past me, making the hairs on my arms stand up beneath my lab coat. The kind of cold that doesn't belong in a climate-controlled lab. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, even to me. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the distant whir of a centrifuge spinning in the adjoining room. My chest tightened. I walked over to the heavy exit door and tested it. It hadn't been opened. I could tell by the resistance of the hydraulic arm. I checked the main entrance next. Still propped open as always. And yet someone, or something, had been here. I was sure of it. I returned to my bench, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a draft from the ventilation system, though I'd never felt anything like that before. Maybe it was a trick of the light, though I knew what I'd seen. I sat back down and stared at the blood tubes lined up in front of me. The labels blurred as my mind raced. Then from behind me I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against metal. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes landed on the far corner of the room, near the storage cabinets. Nothing, just rows of neatly stacked supplies, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer, but I swear I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood, my legs shaky, and edged toward the door. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous bolting from an empty room. I needed to get out of there. As I reached the threshold, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, breathy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the main lab, where a coworker looked up from her workstation, startled. "Are you okay?" she asked, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I explain what had just happened without sounding insane? After a moment, I managed to nod and mutter something about needing fresh air. I never worked alone in the blood bank after that. Whatever I saw, or thought I saw, never happened again. Story 8. I've worked in the lab for over 5 years, and I pride myself on being meticulous. You have to be in this field. One slip-up can mean life or death for a patient. That's why this particular event has been etched in my memory. It wasn't just unusual, it was something I can't explain. It started as an ordinary shift. I was covering the night rotation, where things tend to get quiet. Nights like these are supposed to be easy. run a few tests, log some results, and wait for the clock to hit the end of the shift. The hospital was dimly lit, as always, with that faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional echo of footsteps in the corridors. Around 1 a.m., I decided to take my break. I told the nurses on the floor, "If you have any EPOC samples, please process them yourselves while I'm out." They nodded as they always did, and I stepped away to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. 15 minutes later, I returned to the lab. The room felt colder, which wasn't unusual. The AC in our department has a habit of going haywire at night. But something felt off. I went to check the specimen drop-off tray, and there it was. A small, unlabeled sample vial sitting dead center in the bin. I froze. "Who dropped this off?" I muttered aloud. But of course, no one was there to answer. I leaned closer. The vial was slightly chilled, like it had been freshly collected. But it had no patient ID, no timestamp, nothing. Just a faint residue on the outside, as though someone had handled it with damp gloves. My first instinct was that a nurse forgot to label it, which happens occasionally, but then I remembered I was on break. The nurses know better than to drop off samples when the lab tech is unavailable. They're supposed to run their own EPOCS if I'm not around. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The fluid inside was clear, almost unnaturally so. No cloudiness, no sediment. I placed it on the counter and immediately went to the nurse in charge of the patient rounds. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did someone drop off an EPOC sample while I was out?" She furrowed her brow. "Not that I know of. Everyone's running their own tonight." "Well, one showed up in the lab. Do you know who worked with the patient it might have come from?" She glanced at her chart. "Looks like Nurse Carter had the most recent collection. But if she didn't label it, I'll check with her," I cut in, already turning to leave. Nurse Carter was in room 218, tidying up after administering meds. When I asked her about the sample, her face went pale. "I handled all the collections on my list," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not that one. I swear I labeled everything I touched." "Are you sure?" She nodded frantically. "Positive. Every sample I took tonight is already processed. That's not mine." The unease in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I thanked her and decided to ask the attending physician, thinking maybe someone had forgotten to log the collection properly. Dr. Malik was in his office, typing notes into the computer. When I posed the same question to him, he leaned back in his chair, confused. "No one informed me of any new collections," he said, "and I haven't ordered an EPOC test for hours." I ran a hand through my hair. "Then where did it come from?" "It was sitting in the drop-off tray when I got back." He shrugged. "Maybe someone from another floor made a mistake." I didn't reply. Something about his nonchalant tone irritated me, but it wasn't his fault. I left his office, my mind racing. Back in the lab, the vial was still sitting on the counter where I'd left it. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to just process it or toss it into biohazard. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The fluid inside the vial wasn't completely still. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a faint ripple, as if the liquid was moving on its own. I leaned in closer. No vibration from the counter, no draft from the air vents. The ripple continued, undisturbed. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I muttered. I grabbed the phone and called the charge nurse again. "Listen," I said, keeping my voice low. "Are you absolutely sure no one dropped off a sample for room 218 or anywhere nearby?" There was a pause on the other end. "Room 218?" she repeated slowly. "That's odd. We discharged the patient there hours ago. That room's empty now." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean, empty? Nurse Carter was in there when I spoke to her." "She shouldn't have been," the charge nurse replied. "That room's been vacant since 10 p.m. I hung up without saying another word. My legs felt like lead as I walked back to the lab. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I rounded the corner and stepped inside, my heart stopped. The vial was gone. It hadn't rolled away or fallen off the counter. It was simply gone. The drop-off tray was empty too, as though it had never been there to begin with. I stood there staring at the empty counter, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Did someone come in while I was gone? Was this some kind of sick joke? I checked the lab's security footage later that night, desperate for an explanation. The timestamp showed the moment I left for my break. The room was still, quiet. No one entered. At exactly 1:12 a.m., the camera glitched for a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of static. When the feed resumed, the vial was sitting in the tray. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sign of anyone entering the lab. I don't work night shifts anymore. I told my supervisor I couldn't handle the hours, but that's not the truth. I just couldn't stay in that lab, knowing what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. To this day, I don't know where that sample came from, and I don't want to know. Story 9. I work in a hospital lab that used to be the morgue. It's not something we talk about much. It just lingers in the air like the smell of old disinfectant. I didn't know about it when I started my clinical rotations last year, but once I found out, I couldn't unsee it. The narrow hallways, the oddly heavy doors, even the faint echo that followed you when you walked alone. It all made sense. One night during my clinicals, I was in the chemistry section with a coworker, Allie. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside feels empty. We were chatting about nothing in particular, filling the silence with laughter and small talk. I remember leaning back in my chair, stretching my neck. The lab felt cold, colder than usual, but I shrugged it off. Allie was telling some story about her dog when I felt it. A hand, cold, deliberate, brushed the back of my neck. I swear it wasn't just a draft or my imagination. It was a touch, clear as day, and I jumped out of my chair like I'd been shocked. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, spinning around. Allie looked up, startled at first, then burst out laughing. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, still giggling. "Someone just touched my neck," I said, rubbing the spot. It still tingled, like the ghost of that touch was clinging to me. "There's no one here," she said, looking around dramatically. "Maybe it was Casper." I forced a laugh, but my heart was pounding. The lab was empty except for the two of us. And yet I could still feel it. The pressure, the icy sensation. I didn't sleep that night. When I started working full-time, I pushed that memory aside. It was probably my imagination, I told myself. Stress, lack of sleep, it could have been anything. But then there was the stockroom. The stockroom was the worst part of the lab. It was a long, narrow room lined with shelving carts crammed full of supplies. The overhead lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift whenever you moved. I hated going in there alone, but it was part of the job. One day I was restocking gloves and tubes when it happened. I was standing at one of the shelves checking off inventory when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure, a shadow maybe, peeking around one of the carts. It was quick, just a flash, but unmistakable. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I took a step back, craning my neck to see around the carts. There was no one there. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then it moved again. A head, just barely visible, tilting as if watching me. I didn't wait to see more. My heart was hammering as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Back in the main lab, I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Allie was there, typing something into the computer. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the stockroom." She smirked. "Let me guess, Casper again?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because whatever I saw, it wasn't friendly. After that, I avoided the stockroom as much as possible, but the feeling stayed with me. The cold, the weight of unseen eyes. The lab wasn't just a place to work. It was something else. Something that still remembered what it used to be. Story 10. Here's a story based on your guidelines. It was just another night shift at the lab, or so I thought. I work in a clinical diagnostics lab. Late hours, long silences, and the hum of machines have become my constant companions. That night, I was alone. My coworker had called in sick, and I didn't mind. I actually enjoyed the quiet. Less chatter, more focus. The lab is located in the basement of a larger facility, so no windows, no distractions. The air is always still, unnervingly so. The only sounds are the buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional whir of the centrifuge. It's the kind of silence that presses against you, making you hyper-aware of every noise, every movement. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. I had just retrieved a vial of QC from the freezer, a biorad control, glass bottle, sturdy and solid. Frozen solid, actually. You don't need to be delicate with it, but I always was. It's a habit. I set it down on the table behind me to defrost, far from the edge where it wouldn't roll or be accidentally knocked over. I went back to my work, running samples and recording data. I had my back to the table, completely absorbed in my task. The minutes passed in that strange, elastic way they do during night shifts, time feeling both slow and fast at once. Then out of nowhere, there was a sound. Clang. The sharp noise of glass hitting tiles startled me so much that I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, my hand still holding the pipette I'd been using. The vial of QC lay on the floor behind me, completely intact. It hadn't shattered, which was a miracle considering how far it had fallen. But here's the thing, it shouldn't have fallen at all. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. The table where I'd left it was solid, flat, and stable. I'd placed it nowhere near the edge. Nowhere near. There was no airflow in the lab. The AC was off. The vent hadn't even rattled that night. The vial was still mostly frozen, heavy, with no chance of rolling or toppling over by itself. I stepped closer, slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. My logical brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe I hadn't placed it as securely as I thought. Maybe I'd bumped the table without realizing it. Maybe. But then I saw something that made me stop dead. On the floor around where the vial had landed was a faint smear of condensation, almost like a handprint. No, not almost. It was a handprint. It was too large to be mine and too distinct to ignore. 5 fingers, pale and ghostly, trailing off into nothingness. I crouched, staring at it, my breath shallow. My first instinct was to touch it, but I stopped myself. It was already fading, evaporating into the still air of the lab. A cold wave swept through me. I stood up quickly, backing away. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows that seemed deeper now than they had just minutes before. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe it was just my imagination. I grabbed the vial off the floor, my fingers trembling, and placed it back on the table, this time dead center. My rational mind tried to take control again. Maybe I'd just seen a weird smudge. Maybe the vial had somehow slid off despite every logical reason it shouldn't have. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to get back to work, but my focus was gone. Every little noise made me flinch. The hum of the centrifuge felt sinister, like it was hiding something beneath its mechanical rhythm. Half an hour passed and then another. Nothing else happened, but the room felt different, oppressive, like I wasn't alone anymore. At 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I logged out early, something I never do, and left the lab in a hurry. The silence in the hallway outside felt like a relief, though it shouldn't have. Silence is silence, right? But not in that lab. Not anymore. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my supervisor, not my coworkers. What could I say? A frozen vial of QC flew off a table, and I saw a ghostly handprint. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd think I'd lost it. But I know what I saw. I haven't worked a night shift since. I make excuses, swap schedules, whatever it takes. And when I do work late, I make sure someone else is there. I don't care how ridiculous it sounds. I'm not being alone in that lab ever again. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.